What if the reason people keep getting under your skin isn't their power, but the permission you're accidentally giving them to control the emotional climate of your day? Picture a Sunday lunch. Nothing dramatic. No raised voices. Just the familiar background noise of family. Plates clinking, someone laughing too loudly. A conversation that keeps restarting from the same half-finished sentences. You're sitting there trying to be present, trying to be normal, trying to enjoy it. And then a relative, maybe an uncle, maybe a parent, maybe a cousin who always seems to be joking, drops a comment that lands like a small slap dressed as honesty. Something like, "So, are you still doing that thing?" The smile is there. The tone is light. Everyone is supposed to treat it as harmless. You smile too, because you don't want to make it a scene. You don't want to be the sensitive one. You don't want to ruin the mood. So you swallow it, move on, keep eating, keep nodding. You even laugh at the right moment, like you're cooperating with the script. And then later that night, when the dishes are done, when the house is quiet, you realize the moment didn't end when the lunch ended. It followed you home. It's looping in your mind in perfect clarity, as if your brain saved the audio file and decided to play it on repeat. You're imagining what you should have said. You're imagining how they meant it. You're imagining the look on their face if you'd answered differently. And suddenly, you're not in your living room anymore. You're back at that table, still defending yourself against a sentence that took them 2 seconds to say. This is what it means to be bothered. It's not only the moment, it's the interest you pay afterward. And if you've lived this, you know the most exhausting part is not even the anger. The exhausting part is the feeling that someone else can steal your peace with almost no effort, that they can drop a line, walk away, and you're left carrying the rest of it for hours, sometimes for days. So the aim of this episode isn't to turn you into someone who never feels anger. Anger is human. It's a signal. It often shows up when something you care about is being touched. Respect, fairness, autonomy, belonging, dignity. In that sense, anger is trying to protect you. The problem is when the signal becomes a takeover, when your body heats up and your mind narrows and you lose access to choice. You either explode and regret it, or you swallow it and resent it, and both outcomes leave you feeling like you didn't keep your own standards. And then you replay the whole thing later, because your mind is trying to finish what you didn't finish in the moment. What you really want, when you say, "I never want to get angry again," is something more precise. You want to stay internally steady. You want to remain yourself, even when other people are careless. You want to notice the provocation without becoming it. You want to protect your boundaries without turning into someone you don't recognize. This is the idea I want you to carry from the beginning. Being unbothered doesn't mean you don't feel anything. It means your feelings don't own you. It means you can feel the first spark of anger and still choose what happens next. One of the most useful metaphors for this is the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. A thermometer reflects the room. If the room is tense, you become tense. If the room is rude, you become sharp. If the room is dismissive, you become defensive. A thermostat notices the weather but regulates the climate. It doesn't deny reality. It just refuses to let reality dictate the emotional rules inside your body. A lot of people spend their lives as thermometers without realizing it. They think they're just reacting or just being honest. But what's really happening is that the external world is setting their internal temperature, and the cost is enormous. You lose hours of attention. You lose quality of relationships. You lose your own sense of dignity, not because you lack values, but because you don't have a system. The good news is that this can be trained. not with vague positivity, not with pretending you don't care, with a practical, repeatable method that starts where anger actually starts, in the body and in the meaning your mind assigns to what just happened. Because if we return to that Sunday lunch scene, the real turning point wasn't the comment. It was the moment inside you, right after the comment, the first tightening in the jaw, the first shift in the breath, the quiet urgency that said, "Say something now," or "Don't let them get away with it," or "If you stay silent, you're weak." That urgency feels like truth, but most of the time it's just adrenaline-demanding motion. And if you can learn to recognize urgency without obeying it, you'll discover something surprising. You can protect yourself more effectively when you're calm than when you're angry. Calm isn't weakness. Calm is control. Calm is what allows you to set a boundary cleanly without turning the moment into a mess you'll have to carry home. Over the next parts, we're going to build this system slowly and gently, the way you'd build a foundation. We'll map how a stimulus becomes a spiral. We'll identify your most common emotional hooks in family and relationships, and we'll practice the kind of language that keeps your standards intact without needing heat. And, just as importantly, we'll talk about what happens afterward, how to stop the replay loop so that other people don't keep renting space in your mind for free. Because the real victory isn't winning the moment. The real victory is going home and sleeping peacefully. Let's go back to that Sunday lunch, but slow it down to the exact second your peace gets stolen, because the real change happens before you speak. The comment lands, and you feel it immediately, not as a thought at first, as a physical shift. The jaw tightens, the chest warms, the breath gets a little shallow, and then comes the most important part, the internal urgency that says, almost like a command, "Do something, defend yourself, correct this, win back your dignity right now." That urgency is the doorway. Most people think anger starts with the insult, but anger often starts with a meaning. Your mind takes a small event and turns it into a verdict. They don't respect me, or they're trying to put me in my place, or everyone is watching to see if I'll accept this. And once the moment becomes a verdict about your identity, your body treats it like a threat. You're no longer dealing with a sentence. You're defending your position in the room. This is why the unbothered version of you isn't someone who has fewer emotions. It's someone who catches the chain early enough to stay free. Here's the chain in its simplest form: stimulus to story, to state, to response. The stimulus is the comment. The story is what your mind says it means. The state is what your body becomes once it believes that story: tight, hot, urgent, narrowed. And the response is what you do next. You snap, you freeze, you smile and swallow. You get sarcastic, you over-explain, you shut down. Different styles, same outcome. You lose the calm center you wanted to keep. The reason this model matters is that most people try to fix anger at the last stage. They try to control the response after the body is already flooded. But when you're flooded, your brain becomes less flexible. It starts thinking in absolutes. It starts mind reading. It starts collecting evidence. It starts rehearsing. You can still speak, but you're far less likely to speak in a way you respect afterward. So, the leverage is earlier, at the level of state and story. That's why the first move is bodily, and it's subtle enough that no one at the table even needs to notice. You lengthen your exhale slightly, you release the jaw, and you soften your gaze. You're not doing a technique. You're simply sending your nervous system one message. This is uncomfortable, but it isn't danger. You're trying to lower the temperature by a single degree, just enough that you can choose a response instead of being dragged into one. Then comes the second move, the one that changes your life if you practice it consistently. You loosen your grip on the first interpretation. You don't have to replace it with a happy story. You don't have to excuse the person. You just stop treating your first meaning as fact. Instead of, "They're humiliating me," you shift to something like, "I'm experiencing that as disrespect." That sentence may look small, but it's psychologically huge. It creates distance. It reminds you there is a difference between what happened and what you're telling yourself it means. And once you have distance, you can respond with standards rather than heat. This is the moment where people get confused, so let's be clear. Calming your body and loosening your story does not mean you let them get away with it. It means you stop paying extra. You stop paying with a ruined afternoon. You stop paying with hours of rumination. You stop paying with a version of yourself you don't respect. You're learning to protect your dignity without sacrificing your peace. Now here's the quiet truth. In families, the story often hits harder because the context is older than the comment. A sentence at a table can carry years of history, being judged, compared, dismissed, treated like your life is open for public review. So your nervous system reacts not only to today, but to a whole archive. That's why your reaction can feel bigger than the moment should deserve. And that's also why the solution has to be gentle and structural, not just motivational. In the next part, we'll build your trigger map, the specific themes that hook you most in family, relationships, and friendships, so you can predict the moments that usually steal your calm. And once you can predict them, you can stop being surprised by them, which is half the battle. If you listen closely to that Sunday lunch moment, you'll notice something important. It wasn't just a comment. It was a type of comment. It belonged to a familiar category, the kind that shows up again and again in families, relationships, and friendships, sometimes with different words, but with the same emotional fingerprint. That's what a trigger really is. A trigger isn't random. It's a pattern that touches a value. And once you can name the pattern, it stops feeling like you're being ambushed by life. You begin to recognize the shape of what's happening while it's happening, which means you can respond from clarity instead of heat. In family settings, one of the most common triggers is disrespect disguised as humor. The words arrive as a joke, the tone stays light, and the social pressure is built in. If you react, you're too sensitive. If you stay silent, you feel small. The trap isn't only what was said. It's that you're forced into a choice between your dignity and the vibe of the room. And because you're a decent person, you often choose the vibe, then pay for it later in your mind. Another common trigger is control disguised as advice. Someone frames criticism as concern. "I'm just saying this for your own good." They speak as if your choices are up for review, as if your life needs their approval. On the surface, it's guidance, but underneath it can feel like a quiet takeover, like your autonomy is being treated as optional. If autonomy is one of your core values, that kind of help can light you up faster than a direct insult. Then there's invalidation, which is especially powerful in close relationships. A partner or friend says, "You're overreacting," "You're too sensitive," or "It's not a big deal." And suddenly, you're not only dealing with the original issue, you're dealing with the feeling that your inner world doesn't count. It's a strange kind of loneliness. You're speaking, but you're not being met. And the anger that comes from invalidation often isn't about winning an argument. It's about trying to be recognized as real. And finally, there's guilt disguised as love. This one can be subtle, even tender on the surface. "After everything I've done, if you cared, you would. You're choosing them over us." It pulls on your conscience. It tries to make your boundary feel selfish, and when you're a conscientious person, guilt can hijack you even when you're logically sure you're allowed to say no. Now, here's the shift that makes this useful. You don't need a perfect psychological diagnosis of what category something falls into. You just need enough clarity to stop being surprised, because surprise is a huge part of why you get flooded. When you feel blindsided, your nervous system escalates. When you see the pattern coming, you can stay steady. So let's apply this to the Sunday lunch again, as if we're watching it frame by frame. The relative makes the joke. You feel the spike. Instead of immediately debating what it means or what you should do, you quietly label the category. This is a jab disguised as humor. That label is not a speech you give them. It's a moment of internal clarity. It tells your brain, I know this pattern. I've seen it before. Then you do something equally quiet. You notice the state in your body, not philosophically, not dramatically, just factually. There's heat, there's urgency. The reason this matters is that it stops you from confusing adrenaline with truth. When you're flooded, your mind tends to speak in absolutes. Everything feels personal. Everything feels now or never. Naming the state reminds you, I'm in a stress response. I don't have to obey it. And once you've done those two things, you choose, before words, what kind of response you're going to use. In moments like this, you usually have three broad options. Sometimes you clarify because the fog is the weapon. You ask calmly what they mean, forcing them to own the tone instead of hiding behind it. Sometimes you set a boundary because your standard is the point. You name what you don't accept without turning it into a fight. And sometimes you exit because the room isn't safe for a clean conversation. You step away, not as punishment, but as protection. This is the difference between being a thermometer and being a thermostat in real life. A thermometer reacts to the temperature. A thermostat notices the temperature and then makes a decision about the climate. What I like about this approach is that it doesn't require you to become a different personality. You don't have to become cold or sarcastic or unbothered as a performance. You're simply becoming structurally calm. You're making your response less improvisational and more intentional, which is exactly what keeps you from going home and replaying the scene all night. Because rumination often comes from one painful feeling, unfinished dignity. You feel like you didn't protect yourself. You feel like you cooperated with something that violated your standard, and your mind keeps replaying, trying to rewrite the ending. If you respond cleanly in the moment, even with a small, quiet boundary, your mind has less to fix later. In the next part, we'll translate this into natural language you can actually say in family, relationship, and friendship moments. Not a long list of scripts, and not a communication course, but a few short phrases placed inside realistic scenes, so you can feel how calm boundaries sound when they're spoken by someone who respects themselves. Back at that Sunday lunch, the hardest part isn't finding a clever comeback. The hardest part is staying clean inside yourself while you set a standard. Because the moment someone makes a joke at your expense, your nervous system wants to do one of two things: swallow it to keep peace, or escalate to reclaim dignity. Calm boundaries are the third path, and they work precisely because they don't feed either trap. Here's how it can sound in real life, with natural language that fits a normal table, not a courtroom. Your relative says the line again with that familiar smile. You feel the heat. You take one slower exhale, just enough to interrupt the urgency. Then you look at them, not with anger, not with a grin, and you say simply, I don't like jokes about me like that. And then you stop. That pause matters. If you keep talking, you start negotiating, you start explaining, you start defending yourself. And the moment you defend yourself, you teach the room that your dignity is debatable. But when you say one calm sentence and then let silence land, you're not punishing them. You're letting reality be felt. Sometimes they'll try the classic escape. Oh, come on, I'm joking. This is where most people get pulled into the old script. They either laugh along or they argue about intent. But you don't need to argue about intent. You can keep it clean. I get that you're joking. I still don't like it. Notice what that does. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't moralize. It doesn't beg. It doesn't invite a debate about whether you're allowed to feel what you feel. It just states the boundary again, calmly. If they push harder, if they try to embarrass you for having a boundary, this is the moment to choose structure over emotion. You don't have to raise your voice. You can lower your tempo and narrow your words. Let's change the topic. Or, I'm not doing this. And if it continues, you give yourself permission to exit without drama. You stand up, refill your drink, go to the bathroom, step outside for air. In family dynamics, sometimes the most powerful boundary is not what you say, but what you don't stay for. Now, the same skill shows up differently in a relationship because the trigger is often invalidation, not jokes. Later that day, you tell your partner what happened, hoping for a little warmth, a little solidarity, and they respond with something like, "You're overthinking it." That line can feel like a door closing, not because it's evil, but because it dismisses your inner world. It tells you, your experience is too much. And if you've felt unseen before, that single sentence can light the fuse fast. Again, one calm sentence is better than a long emotional speech. You might say, "I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you not to dismiss me." That's a boundary, but it's also an invitation to a better conversation. It's firm without being hostile. If their tone sharpens and you feel your body rising, you add structure instead of heat. "I want to talk about this, but not while we're both tense. Let's pause and come back." What you're doing here is subtle. You're teaching your relationship a rule. Emotional safety matters more than winning the moment. Now take it into friendships, where the most common trigger is often interruption, teasing that goes too far, or group dynamics that make you feel small. In a group chat, someone replies to your message with a little jab, something that gets laughs from others. This is where people either disappear quietly and resent everyone, or they overreact and look too intense for the vibe. The calm boundary is a middle path, short, unambiguous, and not performative. You can say, "Not a fan of that joke," and then move on. Or, "Let's keep it respectful," and then stop. The point is not to force an apology in the group. The point is to mark your standard without making the moment your entire identity. And there's a deeper principle underneath all of these examples. You don't need people to fully agree with your boundary for it to be valid. A lot of anger comes from trying to make the other person understand before you allow yourself to protect your peace. But if your peace depends on their insight, you'll stay trapped. Some people don't have the emotional skill. Some people don't want to. That doesn't mean you must stay unprotected. So calm language is really about two things: keeping your sentences short and keeping your self-respect non-negotiable. Short sentences reduce escalation. Non-negotiable standards reduce rumination. Because rumination usually happens when you leave the situation feeling like you abandoned yourself. Your brain replays the scene, trying to fix the ending. But when you respond cleanly, even with one steady sentence, you give your mind closure. Not perfect closure, enough closure. In the next part, we'll talk about what happens after the moment, the replay loop. I'll show you a simple 2-minute reset you can do after a triggering interaction so that the event doesn't keep charging interest in your head all night. Because being unbothered isn't only about what you say at the table, it's about what you refuse to keep carrying afterward. When you leave a triggering moment, the argument often doesn't end. It simply changes location. You drive home, you shower, you scroll, you try to be over it, and yet your mind keeps returning to the same 30 seconds like it's searching for a missing piece. The comment, the tone, the laughter at the table, the part where you smiled even though you didn't want to. And the more you replay it, the more it feels like you're doing something useful, like you're preparing, like you're learning, like you're protecting yourself for next time. But most replay isn't protection. It's an unpaid bill collecting interest. Your brain is trying to restore a feeling of control by rewriting the past, and it does that by generating alternate endings. The perfect sentence, the perfect look, the perfect moment of strength. That's why rumination can feel oddly satisfying for a second, even while it drains you. It gives you the illusion of resolution without the reality of it. So the key to being unbothered is not only what you do in the room, it's what you do in the first few minutes afterward, when your mind tries to keep the door open. Here's a gentle truth. Your brain doesn't ruminate because you're dramatic. It ruminates because something feels unfinished. Unfinished dignity, unfinished boundaries, unfinished clarity. If you left the table feeling like you abandoned yourself, your mind will try to correct that by replaying the moment until it finds an ending it can live with. The way out is not to force the replay to stop by willpower. The way out is to give your brain a cleaner kind of closure. Think of it as a small reset you run right after the moment or later that evening when you notice the replay starting again. You don't need 10 steps. You need a short sequence that turns the experience into a completed file. You start by naming what's happening in simple language. This is the replay loop. Not, I'm losing my mind. Not, I'll never get over this. Just a calm label. When you label it, you stop being fully inside it. You become the observer again, and that alone lowers the temperature. Then you give the moment one clean sentence, something that captures the truth without drama. Not a speech, not a verdict, just a line you could stand by. For example, that joke didn't work for me, and next time I'll name it once. Or, I don't need to earn respect at this table. I can set a boundary and move on. This sentence is important because it replaces endless replay with a simple, stable meaning. And then you do one small action that signals to your nervous system that the moment is over. This is where people miss the point. They try to solve rumination with more thinking, but rumination is partly a body state. So, you bring the body back into the present. You take a short walk, you wash your face, you stretch, you breathe slowly for a minute. Not to be spiritual, but to tell your system, we are safe. The threat has passed. If you want to make this even more effective, you add one final move. You decide what the next right action is, and you keep it small. Maybe the next right action is that you won't bring the scene to your partner as a raw fight. It becomes a simple request. I had a hard moment today. I'd like support. Maybe it's that you'll text a friend and talk about something real for 5 minutes. Maybe it's that you'll write one note to yourself, what you'll say next time. Then you close the Notes app and you're done. This is what closure looks like in practice. Not the perfect comeback, not the other person finally understanding, just you deciding calmly, I handled what I could, I learned what matters, and I'm not paying for this again tonight. Because here's the hidden cost of rumination. It makes one difficult person feel bigger than your whole life. It narrows your attention until your day is shaped by someone else's carelessness. And the most mature form of strength is refusing that trade. You can still care about respect, still care about boundaries, still care about being seen, without turning your mind into a courtroom that runs all night. Now, there's one more reason people get stuck in replay. They confuse letting go with surrender. They think if they stop replaying, it means what happened was fine, or it means they were weak, or it means the other person won. But you can release the replay while still holding the standard. Letting go is not approval. Letting go is ending the payment. In the next part, we'll talk about the category of people who make this hardest, the chronically difficult ones, the ones who bait, guilt, invalidate, or repeat the same disrespect in new packaging. We'll explore how to choose your battles, how to use distance without hatred, and how compassion can become a form of power, not because it excuses them, but because it stops you from absorbing them. Some people aren't just having a bad day. Some people have a pattern. They poke, they invalidate, they guilt trip, they turn every boundary into a debate. And if you grew up in a family where that pattern was normal, where sarcasm was love, criticism was concern, and your feelings were too much, then you can spend years trying to win a game that isn't designed for you to win. You keep hoping that if you say it the right way, at the right time, with the right tone, they'll finally become reasonable. Sometimes they do, often they don't. And this is where being unbothered becomes less about technique and more about access. Because the truth is, you can regulate your breathing and reframe your thoughts. But if you keep giving the same person unlimited access to your nervous system, you'll keep paying the bill, not because you're failing, because you're standing too close to the fire. So let's say something clean. You are not required to be emotionally available to people who are emotionally unsafe. That doesn't mean you hate them. It doesn't mean you label them as villains. It just means you stop treating chronic disrespect as something you must personally solve with endless patience. You can love someone and still limit how much of your inner world they get to touch. This is especially important in families, because family dynamics have gravity. A relative can say one line and it lands deeper than it should, because it comes with history, hierarchy, old roles. It's not just a joke. It's a familiar position you're being pushed back into. And if you don't recognize that, you'll keep reacting as if you're trying to fix your entire past at a dinner table. The way out is to choose your battles with a different question. Not who's right, not how do I make them understand. The question is, what's the cost of engaging with this person in this moment? If the cost is your peace for the next 12 hours, you're allowed to choose a smaller move. You're allowed to choose distance. You're allowed to choose a boundary that's quiet but firm. And sometimes the most powerful boundary is simply not taking the bait. Difficult people often use speed and framing. They want you to answer immediately, emotionally, so they can define you as too sensitive, dramatic, disrespectful, whatever story makes them feel in control. If you slow the tempo, if you pause, if you keep your words short, if you step away, you refuse their frame. You stop playing on their field. This is where compassion can become a kind of power, but not the sentimental kind. Compassion in this context is not excusing them. Compassion is seeing their behavior as information about them rather than a verdict about you. It's recognizing that some people criticize because they're anxious, control because they're afraid, mock because they're insecure, and guilt trip because they don't know how to ask cleanly. When you see that, you don't get hypnotized by the performance. You don't absorb it as identity. You can think quietly, this is their pattern showing itself. I don't have to carry it. And then you act accordingly. Sometimes accordingly is a calm boundary at the table. Sometimes it's changing the topic. Sometimes it's leaving early. Sometimes it's not attending every gathering the same way. Sometimes it's sitting near the door, having your own ride, giving yourself a time limit, or planning a decompression routine afterward so you don't bring their energy home. This is what I mean by redesigning access. You stop treating exposure as a moral duty. You're not saying, I refuse family. You're saying, I refuse unlimited impact. Now let's bring it into friendships and relationships, because the difficult pattern looks different there. With friends, it might be the person who always teases, then calls you sensitive when you draw a line. With a partner, it might be the person who invalidates your feelings, then gets frustrated when you shut down. In both cases, the rule is the same. You don't need to win their agreement to protect your standard. You can say calmly, I'm not doing this conversation in that tone, and then pause. You can say, I want to be close to you, but dismissing me isn't okay. And then stop talking. You can say, we can revisit this when we're both calmer, and actually revisit it, because consistency is what teaches people your boundaries are real. And if someone repeatedly refuses to meet a basic standard, after clear communication, after calm boundaries, after time, then the question becomes less romantic and more honest. What kind of relationship is this creating inside me? If the relationship consistently makes you smaller, more anxious, more self-doubting, more reactive, it doesn't matter how much you should tolerate it. Your nervous system is giving you data. You can love people and still choose yourself. One quiet way to think about it is this: you're not trying to eliminate anger. You're trying to stop donating your attention. Difficult people win when they take your attention long after the moment ends, when they make you rehearse, explain, justify, fantasize about winning, fantasize about repair. Being unbothered means you return your attention to your own life faster, again and again, until your mind learns a new default. I don't live in reaction. In the next part, we'll turn everything into a simple, in-the-moment protocol you can use anywhere. Family, partner, friends, especially when you're caught off guard. Not a long checklist, but a small sequence you can practice until it becomes automatic. What you do in the first 10 seconds, what you say in one sentence, and what you do afterward, so the moment doesn't follow you home. When you're caught off guard, you don't need a philosophy. You need a sequence, something small enough to remember, strong enough to work, and gentle enough that it doesn't turn you into a colder person. Because in real life, anger doesn't announce itself. It arrives in a sentence, a tone, a look. Then, your body is already moving before your mind has decided what you believe. So here's the protocol I want you to practice until it becomes familiar. Not as a checklist you recite, but as a rhythm you can fall into. Think of it as 3 phases: stabilize, choose, close. First, stabilize. In the first few seconds, your only job is to stop the internal temperature from spiking. Not to become perfectly calm, just calm enough to stay in the driver's seat. This is where the smallest physical moves matter. A longer exhale than inhale, a relaxed jaw, shoulders dropping a fraction, gaze softening. If you do nothing else, do this. It's the difference between having options and being dragged. You'll notice the mind trying to rush you. It will say, answer now, or don't let them get away with it. Or if you pause, you'll look weak. But the pause is not weakness. The pause is sovereignty. It's you refusing to be controlled by adrenaline. Second, choose. Once you've bought yourself even a little space, you decide what kind of response you're going to use. Not the words yet, the category. This is the part that keeps you from improvising while flooded. In most situations, your response falls into one of three lanes: clarify, boundary, or exit. Clarify is for moments where the fog is doing damage. Someone says something vague and sharp, then hides behind, "I didn't mean it like that." A calm, clarifying question forces reality into the open. Something like, "What do you mean by that?" Or, "Can you say that more directly?" You're not attacking, you're turning on the lights. Boundary is for moments where you already know enough. The behavior itself is the issue. Here the best boundaries are short, behavior-focused, and not theatrical. "I don't like being spoken to like that," or "That joke doesn't work for me," or "Don't interrupt me." Then you stop. The boundary isn't your explanation, it's your standard. Exit is for moments where the situation is escalating or the person is baiting you. This is where you protect your nervous system with timing. "I'm going to step away for a minute," or "Let's pause and come back," or "I'm not continuing this right now." Exit isn't defeat. Exit is strategic distance. It's you refusing to let the room decide your internal climate. What matters here is that you don't mix lanes while you're triggered. Mixing creates negotiation. Negotiation creates heat. Pick a lane. Keep it clean. Third, close. This is the part most people ignore, and it's why they stay bothered for hours after a moment that lasted seconds. After the interaction, your mind will want to replay it, to fix it, to perfect it, to win it retroactively. If you want to be unbothered, you close the file. Closing looks like this. You name the replay, quietly without drama. Then you give yourself one clean sentence that captures the truth, and you return to the present with one small action. For example, "That crossed my line, I named it. I'm done paying for it tonight." Then you do something physical and grounding. A short walk, washing your face, a glass of water, a few slow breaths. The body needs a signal that the threat is over. And if you notice yourself still rehearsing later, you don't argue with the rehearsal. You redirect it. You treat it like a song stuck in your head. You acknowledge it, then you choose the next track. You return attention to something you value: your work, your friend, your rest, your life. Not as avoidance, but as reclamation. Now, let's place this protocol back into the Sunday lunch scene so it doesn't stay abstract. The comment lands. You stabilize with one breath. You choose a lane, boundary. You say one sentence: "I don't like jokes about me like that." You stop talking. If they push, you don't debate intent. You repeat the boundary once, then you exit to the bathroom or step outside if needed. Later, at home, when the replay starts, you close it with one sentence and one grounding action. You don't let the moment charge interest. This is how unbothered is built. Not by never feeling anger, but by shortening the takeover and refusing the replay. In the next part, we'll deepen one final layer that makes this sustainable. How to keep your boundaries firm without becoming rigid. How to repair relationships when you want closeness. And how to know when a pattern is telling you that the healthiest choice is distance. Because the ultimate goal isn't to win interactions, it's to live in a calmer inner home. If you've ever tried to stay calm and ended up feeling like you were swallowing yourself, this part is for you. Because there's a version of calm that isn't freedom. It's suppression. It's you going quiet while your body is still on fire. It's you smiling while your mind is taking notes for a future explosion. And that version of calm doesn't heal anything. It just delays the bill. So the question becomes, how do you stay unbothered without becoming numb, passive, or emotionally unavailable? The answer is that you separate three things that people often mix together: your boundary, your tone, and your closeness. Your boundary is what you will and won't participate in. That's the structural part. Your tone is how you deliver it. That's the emotional style. Your closeness is the relationship you want afterward. That's the human part. When people get stuck, it's usually because they treat a boundary like an emotional weapon. They either stay nice and lose themselves, or they become harsh and punish because harshness feels like protection. But harshness also creates distance you may not actually want, especially in family, friendships, and love. The skill is learning to keep boundaries firm while keeping your heart soft. And that often looks like this. You set the boundary in one clean sentence, and then, later, when you're calm, you repair if repair is appropriate. Repair isn't apologizing for the boundary. Repair is clarifying the intention behind it. For example, imagine the Sunday lunch again. You say calmly, "I don't like jokes about me like that." You don't argue. You don't lecture. You simply hold the line. Then, if you want to preserve the relationship, you can follow up later, privately, when the room isn't watching, with a sentence that makes closeness possible without reopening the boundary. Something like, "I'm not trying to make things awkward. I just don't want to be joked about that way." That one line does something powerful. It tells the other person, "I'm still here. I'm still human. But this is the standard." The same thing applies in a relationship. If your partner says, "You're overthinking it," and you respond, "I'm not asking you to agree. I'm asking you not to dismiss me," you've set the boundary. But the relationship doesn't have to end there. Later, once the temperature is lower, you can add a repair that invites connection. What I needed in that moment was support. Even just a "that sounds frustrating" would have helped. That's not begging. That's teaching. It's giving the relationship a chance to improve while protecting your nervous system from the dismissive pattern. In friendships, repair can be even lighter. If a friend teases too far and you say, "Not a fan of that joke," you don't need a long conversation in the group chat. But later, one-on-one, you might say, "I know you weren't trying to hurt me. I just don't want that to be our dynamic." Again, soft heart, hard line. Now, here's the part that keeps you from becoming rigid. You don't treat every irritation as a boundary moment. Sometimes the best boundary is internal. You decide not to take it personally. You decide the comment isn't worth your energy. You decide the person is acting from stress or insecurity, and you let it pass without absorbing it. That's not weakness. That's discernment. It's choosing your battles based on cost. A helpful question is this a value issue or an ego issue? A value issue means something truly matters here: respect, safety, fairness, trust. An ego issue means your pride is hurt, but your life isn't actually threatened, and you might be able to let it go without betraying yourself. The more you can tell the difference, the more unbothered you become, because you stop spending your energy proving yourself in situations that don't deserve a performance. But there's also a harder truth we need to hold. Sometimes the pattern is not improving. Sometimes you've communicated. You've set boundaries. You've repaired gently. And the person keeps doing it, maybe because they can't change, maybe because they don't want to, maybe because the dynamic benefits them. In those cases, being unbothered becomes less about moment-to-moment technique and more about relationship design. Design means you change the conditions, you limit exposure, you shorten visits, you stop sharing vulnerable information, You stop expecting emotional skill where it doesn't exist. You plan exits. You adjust the level of access they have to your inner world, not as revenge, as hygiene. Because peace isn't only something you create through breathing and reframing. Peace is also something you create by choosing the environments and relationships that don't constantly trigger your nervous system. And this is where many people feel guilty, especially with family. They think distance is cruelty, but distance can be kindness when closeness keeps turning into harm. Distance can be the thing that allows you to remain respectful without becoming resentful. So the deepest form of never getting angry might be this. You stop putting yourself in positions where anger is your only form of self-protection. You stop relying on explosions to create space. You build space deliberately. Now, to close this part, I want to give you a single idea you can carry into your next difficult interaction. You can be warm without being movable. Warmth is your humanity. Movability is your boundary. When you keep those separate, you become calmer. Not because people become better, but because you become clearer. In the next part, we'll bring everything together into a simple daily practice. Something you can actually do over a week that makes unbothered your default. We'll also craft a calm closing that echoes the Sunday lunch scene, so the episode ends like a circle closing, not like a lecture finishing. If you want Never Get Angry to become more than a good idea, you need a practice that's small enough to repeat, but structured enough to rewire you over time, not a dramatic transformation. A quiet one, because the nervous system learns through repetition and your mind learns through evidence. So here's the simplest weekly structure I've found that actually changes people. You spend 7 days collecting clean data about your anger, and then you use that data to install one new default response, not 100 new habits, just one. Think about how most people handle anger. They wait until it happens, then they improvise under stress. That's like trying to learn swimming only when you're already in deep water. The goal of a weekly practice is to train when the water is shallow, so you don't panic when it gets deep. Day 1 starts with noticing. You don't try to fix anything yet. You just track the first signal. When someone bothers you, even slightly, you ask quietly, what was the trigger category? Disrespect as humor, control as advice, invalidation, guilt, or something else. Then you name what happened in the body: jaw, chest, breath, urgency, and you write one sentence later that evening. Today my anger was triggered by mao, and my body did mao. This sounds almost too basic, but it does something profound. It shifts you from being inside the emotion to studying it. It creates distance. It turns anger from a personality trait into a pattern. Over the next few days, something becomes obvious. You begin to see that your anger has a handful of reliable entry points. For some people, it's tone. For others, it's being dismissed. For others, it's being controlled. And once you know your entry point, you can choose the one intervention that stops the spiral early. That intervention, for most people, is not a clever phrase. It's a pause. A pause plus one clean sentence. The pause is how you stabilize. The clean sentence is how you hold your standard without escalating, and the reason this works is that it removes the two fuels that keep you bothered: urgency and rumination. Now here's the part that makes this practice real. Each day you pick one moment, just one, where you attempt the three-phase protocol: stabilize, choose, close. You don't need to do it perfectly. You don't need to do it every time. The goal is not perfection. The goal is evidence. You stabilize with one longer exhale, jaw release, softened gaze. You choose your lane, clarify, boundary, or exit. You deliver one clean sentence. Then later, when the replay tries to start, you close the file with one line. I handled what I could. I learned what matters. I'm done paying for this tonight. Over a week, if you do this even a few times, you start feeling something subtle. Your anger stops feeling like a wave that throws you around and starts feeling like a signal you can hold. That shift is what people mean when they say unbothered. Not that life becomes nicer, but that your inner world becomes less dependent on life being nice. And once you're less dependent, your boundaries get cleaner too, because you stop using anger as a tool. You stop needing explosions to create space. You start creating space intentionally through shorter visits, clearer limits, gentler repairs, and sometimes necessary distance. You realize you can be warm without being movable. Let's close the circle with that Sunday lunch, because endings matter. Imagine the same scene happening again, not because you're unlucky, but because patterns repeat. The comment comes, the smile, the tone, the subtle invitation to either laugh along or fight. This time, you feel the spark, and you recognize it. You take a breath. You name the category. You choose your lane. You say calmly, I don't like jokes about me like that. And then you return to your plate. Not because you're defeated, because you're free. Later, at home, your mind tries to replay it, but the file feels closed. You didn't abandon yourself. You didn't become cruel. You didn't perform. You just protected your standard with minimal cost. And for the first time in a while, you realize you're not paying interest on someone else's carelessness. That's the real promise of this episode. Not that people will stop being difficult, but that they'll stop renting space in your nervous system for free. If you want to turn this into something concrete starting today, keep it simple for 1 week. Notice the trigger, stabilize the body, choose the lane, close the file. That's it. 7 days, not forever. Just long enough for your brain to see a new pattern. And if you want a short affirmation to anchor this, something that's not cheesy but still memorable, here it is. I respond. I don't react. Say it quietly to yourself before the next hard conversation, and if you want, leave it as a comment, less as a performance, more as a commitment. Because repetition is how you build a calmer inner home. If you take one thing from this episode, let it be this. Anger is not the enemy. The takeover is. The takeover is the moment your body gets flooded, your mind narrows, and your life becomes a reaction to someone else's behavior. Becoming unbothered isn't about pretending you don't care. It's about staying connected to what you care about without letting it steal your whole day. You'll still feel sparks sometimes. That's normal. But when you feel them, you'll recognize the chain. You'll stabilize your body just enough to stay in choice. You'll choose a lane, clarify, boundary, or exit without improvising from heat. And afterward, you'll close the file so the moment doesn't follow you home and charge interest in your mind. This is what a calm life looks like in practice. Not a life with perfect people. A life where difficult people don't get unlimited access to your nervous system. A life where your standards are clear, your responses are clean, and your attention returns to you faster and faster. Because attention is your life, and you don't have to donate it to every careless tone or thoughtless comment. So the next time someone tries to hand you the remote control to your mood, you don't need to fight. You don't need to prove. You just take the remote back, quietly, by responding instead of reacting. And if you want a simple line to carry into the next hard conversation, here it is. I respond, I don't react.